In tedious exile, now too long detained, Daedalus languished for his native land. The sea foreclosed his flight, yet thus he said, though earth and water in subjection laid, O cruel Minos, thy dominion be, will go through air, for sure the air is free. Then to new arts his cunning thought applies, and to improve the work of nature tries. A row of quills in gradual order placed, rise by degrees in length from first to last. As on a cliff the ascending thicket grows, or different reeds the rural pipe compose. Along the middle runs a twine of flax, the bottom stems are joined by pliant wax. Thus, well compact, a hollow bending brings the fine composure into real wings. His boy, young Icarus, that near him stood, on thinking of his fate, with smiles pursued the floating feathers, which the moving air bore loosely from the ground and wasted here and there, or with the wax impertinently played, and with his childish tricks the great design delayed, the final master stroke at last imposed, and now the neat machine completely closed. Fitting his pinions on, a flight he tries, and hung self-balanced in the beaten skies. Then thus instructs his child, my boy, take care to wing your course along the middle air. If low, the surges wet your flagging plumes. If high, the sun the melting wax consumes. Steer beneath both, nor to the northern skies, nor south Orion turn your giddy eyes. But follow me, let me before you lay rules for the flight and mark the pathless way. Then teaching with a fond concern his son, he took the untried wings and fixed them on, but fixed with trembling hands, and as he speaks, the tears rolled gently down his aged cheeks, then kissed, and in his arms embraced him fast, but knew not this embrace must be the last. And mounting upward, as he wings his flight, back on his charge he turns his aching sight, as parent birds, when first their callow care, leave the high nest to tempt the liquid air, then cheers him on, and oft with fatal art reminds the stripling to perform his part. Welcome to my mostly non-spoiler review of Alternate Routes by Tim Powers. And this was published in 2018. As you can see by the cover here, unlike many of Tim Powers' works, the setting is contemporary. And first, I'd like to thank Baen Books for sending along Alternate Routes and Stolen Skies. This is book 1 and book 3 of the Vickery and Castine trilogy. This is Tim Powers' latest series. The second book is Forced Perspectives, and the cover art on these is so cool. And this one looks like an alien encounters story, so I'm really looking forward to reading this. It looks like a lot of fun. If you know anything about Tim Powers, he tends to write secret histories or draws inspiration from the classics, romantic poetry, mythology, and religion. He's the author of Anubis Gates and one of the fathers of steampunk. So definitely check out Jordan's Steampunk Must-Reads video if you want to learn more there. On his sources of inspiration, Tim Powers says that he likes to begin with the research, and then from the research, he notes things that are too cool not to use, and from there, the story emerges. And The Stress of Her Regard was the first Tim Powers book that I have read that was published a little over 30 years ago now, and I went into that book not really knowing what to expect. All I knew was that it was based on Byron, Keats, Shelley, the young romantics being chased around by vampires. And I was really expecting, I think, something more along the lines of Kostova's The Historian, which, stress of her regard, was definitely not that. But now that I've read 2 Tim Powers books, I know that Stress of Regard was very much Tim Powers in his style. And I feel like I need to reread it with that in mind and shift my expectations. And just looking again at this cover here, you would probably expect a campy, Mulder, Scully, like X-Files type of dynamic, like a kind of breezy beach read. And this is definitely not that. But I do absolutely love this cover art by Todd Lockwood, and the details he really gets perfectly. You can even see a little factory down there and a bunch of pigeons. And it says, "The ghosts of the freeway are rising." And while the book itself is entertaining and action-packed, it's not light and campy. So what is it then like to read Alternate Routes? Well, it's like a combination of Dan Brown and Neil Gaiman. If you read those books merged together inside of a Salvatore Dali painting with a light misting of Harlan Ellison, I think that captures the feel, maybe. And there's lots of car chases in this book and gunfights, and it's technically a work of labyrinthine literature. So it's inspired by the story of Daedalus and Icarus from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and specifically Powers works with the Dryden translation, which is actually what I read from in the intro here, not the version I was holding because I wanted to match the vibe of the book, but that's not the version I had. Anyway, Daedalus was an inventor and craftsman, and he built the labyrinth to trap the Minotaur in Crete for King Minos. And then he builds wings to escape Crete with his son Icarus, and Icarus plunges to his death after the wax melts from his wings when he flies too close to the sun. Powers also cites Joan Didion and her writing specifically focused on reflections around California as a source of inspiration. She sadly passed away recently, December 23rd at 87 years old. And on that note, that actually reminds me, I'm going to be right up front with this. The ending of this book made me cry. So here's what Alternate Routes is about. Have you ever noticed the vibration of cars on the highway? What if those vibrations generated a special type of field that thinned the divide between this world and the afterlife, or some other plane that isn't quite the afterlife? Such a field exists on the LA freeways, and ghosts, termed deleted persons by the government's Transportation Utility Agency, or TUA, are able to communicate across radio frequencies, or even appear before your eyes if you've seen death. These ghosts are driven by a force that threatens to swallow LA and unleash phantasmic chaos. Sebastian Vickery is a former U.S. Secret Service agent living life on the lam as an Unter driver, a professional Uber-type driver who is an expert at evading ghosts. He also occasionally works food trucks and cleans up highway rubbish. Vickery overheard delicate information from a private phone call with a ghost 4 years earlier during an Obama motorcade. Agents were sent to take out Vickery, but he managed to escape. At the time, Ingrid Castine worked for the TUA, the government agency that communicates with highway ghosts. She was on the team responsible for the call Vickery overheard. 4 years later, their paths cross again when Castine locates Vickery to warn him that her agency, the TUA, tracked him down. Together, on the run from both the government and their ghost informants, Castine and Vickery visit obscure locations in the LA underbelly, or more precisely, the Uncanny Valley. camouflage themselves with ghost-shielding absurdities, and venture into a surreal labyrinth of ghosts whirling around a foreboding, thumping factory. Names and symbols are very important to Tim Powers. So let's start by dissecting the characters' names a little bit. So first off, we have our protagonist, and most of the story is told from his perspective, and that is Sebastian Vickery. And his real name was Herbert Woods. Remember, he was the former Secret Service agent who had to go on the run and into hiding from the government. And so it makes sense then that Vickery comes from vicarious, and that's Latin, and in Latin that means a substitute. And I'm not sure if there was too much meaning behind the choice of using the name Sebastian, other than that would come from Saint Sebastian in Christianity. He was a martyr. He was shot with a bunch of arrows and either like died for a short time and came back to life, or I don't know. I don't know if he crossed over to the other side or not, and that's why Powers chose him. But also, apparently, athletes and race car drivers pay patronage to Saint Sebastian. So maybe with all the car chase scenes in here and how important cars are, maybe that is where Sebastian came from. And then we have Ingrid Castine, and she's our female lead here. And you don't get the story from her perspective at all. She was a TUA agent, and she teams up with Vickery in the story. And Ingrid means fair, loved, beautiful, and Castine comes from the Latin castus, which means cut off, separated, pure. So that's where chastity or chaste also comes from, that Latin root. Both Vickery and Castine are drawn to each other by forces beyond their control. There's a lot of tension between them, but they're both romantically unavailable. Let's begin with a few of the things that I liked. And one thing that I absolutely love about Tim Powers in general is the research that he does and incorporates into his books. He uses lots of poems, quotes, historical facts, and artifacts. I find it very, very inspiring, and it makes me want to learn more. And it also makes me super aware of the giant humanities knowledge hole that I have because my education is in engineering, physics, and biogeochemistry. But by reading with intention for these reviews, I'm hoping to learn more and round myself out. So I'm having a lot of fun doing this. And I also like how Tim Powers manages to conjure fantastical elements from the mundane. And in his descriptions, nothing is ever too beautiful. For example, he'll give a good smell along with a bad smell. Nothing can just ever smell like lavender or cedar. It needs to be mixed with ozone or gasoline. And he also gives the repeated mention of oleander trees in his book, and ghosts and oleanders make me think of The Haunting of Hill House, because Eleanor sees this wall of oleander trees when she's driving to Hill House, and they're like around these kind of crumbling pillars, and she imagines that they're protecting some kind of portal to a fairyland. And that is actually very Tim Powers. And I always love Powers' attention to symbols and details. He calls the field generated by the freeway traffic vibrations amplified possibility fields. And he writes, flocks of pigeons all flying together made shapes that twisted and stretched and compressed over the freeway lanes. The fluid masses of birds flaring white when 100 of them all tilted at once, then becoming nearly invisible in the moments when they were flying directly away. The freeway gypsies said the pigeons liked to ride the edges of the amplified possibility fields around the freeways, and Vickery was relieved to see that the birds were not straying far from the lanes here. So when the birds aren't far from the lanes, that means the field isn't very strong, so there's not a lot of paranormal activity going on. Similar to the pigeons, another way to figure out how strong a field is to have two radios placed in the car, one battery powered, one powered by the engine, and they're set to the same station. So if the radios start playing out of sync, well, the field is strong and it is dangerous. And there's even more historical connections, of course. One is the Emancipation Run of 1896. This was a vehicle convoy from London to Brighton in celebration of the Locomotives on Highways Act. And the act increased highway speed limit to 14 miles per hour. And so this is when those fields began being generated for longer periods of time when there was more vehicle traffic. Okay, before they were just generated for shorter blips of time, like when a train would go by, for example. Another thing that I liked is, so Vickery was a former Secret Service agent, but also former LAPD. And so he had an informant named Rachel Voss, and she's dressed up as Supergirl on Hollywood Boulevard, so people go get their pictures taken with her. And while he's there looking for her, he sees Jack Sparrow. So I thought it was really cute, his little nod to himself, because he's the author of On Stranger Tides, which the Pirates of the Caribbean movie with the same name was, of course, based on Power's story. And the other thing I liked, I'm just pointing out Rachel Voss for this one moment, is because her last name, Voss, means malicious fox. And I knew that, and the reason I knew that is because Jordan and I have been writing a fantasy book together for the past couple of years, and one of our characters has the name Voss, and that's why we chose the name Voss. So I thought that was a fun name for an informant. And this is probably due to my imagination, but I liked this. There was a graveyard scene with a ghost, and there are a few occurrences with ghosts, and their tongues would just roll out of their mouth. And every time that tongue thing happened, I would just envision Gina Davis from Beetlejuice, and that was fun for me. Anyway, and like any Tim Powers works, there's reoccurring themes, at least that I've seen, like between alternate routes and Stress of Her Regard, like the duel of logic and chaos, that math is deterministic and wards off ethereal randomness, crossing through portals, and there's references to Dante and Orpheus crossing over to the beyond and back, and Vickery and Castine go on a similar type of adventure together. Here's a few things that I had problems with, and in typical Tim Powers fashion, you are thrown into the story and have to make sense of it in real time, which, yeah, that happens a lot in fantasy, but I always find myself like wildly confused. And the beginning of chapter 2 is just jarring. You expect Victory's point of view, but then you kind of realize after a little bit, it's not his point of view, and there's like a bunch of people alternating, trying to say like weird sentences, like just one person says one word, the next person says another word, and it takes a bit to figure out what is going on and what is taking place. I felt like I was in a Beckett play in that second chapter. And the same thing happened to me when I read Stress of Her Regard. I had to reread the first couple of chapters after I had finished the book, and then they made more sense. And I suppose that's also a plus, because Powers novels are very much rereadable. And like Stress of Her Regard, scenes from that have still stuck with me, and I would be happy to return to that now. Again, and there were also some interesting ideas and alternate routes that were not fully fleshed out. So for example, Powers mentions that spending time on a highway when you have those ghostly fields, that slows the aging process, which broke my brain a little bit when I tried to figure out whether this meant that people who spent a lot of time driving, like truckers, would age more slowly. And I just really wanted like a couple more sentences to clarify that, because I was just really curious, but I guess that could also ruin the sense of wonder. And there's another thing that was used in Stress of Her Regard that made a repeat here, and that was the reciting of multiplication tables. And that really reminded me of Josephine's character in Stress of Her Regard, and I did not like her character very much. So in this book, like Vickery and Castine go through like doing arithmetic and going through multiplication tables together to like keep each other grounded with like determinism and logic. And I get what Powers was doing. It's just I had just read Stress of Her Regard a couple months ago, so it didn't feel like super creative to me or super original to me, which I know these were written like 30 years apart from each other. So that could have been just a me problem. And speaking of math being deterministic, So Vickery and Castine carry around these abacus strings with 10 beads on each string to kind of stay grounded, to like try to like count the beads. And one thing that was really bothering me with that was like, wouldn't just like having your hands like work, like counting fingers? There's 10 fingers. Like, couldn't you just do like 10 from 2 is 8? Or maybe it's easy to forget about the hands. Like maybe it had to be not part of your body. Or maybe the character's hands like could have turned into like flippers at some point or something, so that the possibility would be erased. Just minor issue, and I don't know why my brain went there. And the secondary POV is Agent Terracotta, and he took me a little bit to get into. He was the starting POV in chapter 2, and I found myself mostly relieved that his parts were short, yet his ending role in the book was super important and the most intriguing part for his storyline, and it felt really rushed. I felt myself wanting a little bit more there. But then in the same vein, I thought that several pages too many were spent in the labyrinth in the story. And that could have just been my fault, because I did a lot of reading of this book late at night when I was tired, and it's really hard to follow like surreal, dreamlike scenes when you're tired, because there's like kind of like no predictable pattern to it. So like it's easy to miss things that are going on, and like I had to reread parts a few times. But that reminds me, I liked that in these labyrinth, like dreamlike scenes, you can only see things in your peripheral vision, and that they change when you look directly at them into something else. Okay, and then my last little PV thing comes from the civil engineer in me, and I know probably a lot of people would not have a problem with this, but cement was used interchangeably a lot in this book with concrete, and they're not the same thing. Cement is an ingredient in concrete. It's the paste that holds the concrete aggregates together, because concrete is made up of sand and gravel or crushed stones. So the cement actually holds the concrete together, and I can understand when writing how you might use them interchangeably, but they're not the same thing, and it bothers me a little bit. Anyway, that is it there. Before I wrap up here in a moment, I'm just going to quickly go through my ratings. So story, I rated an 8. Everything came together very nicely. I loved the sources of inspiration, the labyrinthine tale based on Daedalus and Icarus. I loved all of that. And also the communicating with ghosts, and it was just so much fun. All the little chase scenes, there was lots of action, but it was also just like, it was a still somewhat challenging read, which I like to be intellectually challenged sometimes when I read. Other times when my brain's really tired, I just want something kind of straightforward that plays like a video in my head. But it was very much satisfying. The characters, I rated a 7.5. Vickery and Castine are definitely more relatable than Crawford and Josephine from Stress of Her Regard. I feel like they actually have real emotions, and their connections to other people feel a little more genuine. You don't get a lot of deep inner thoughts from Vickery, but it's also not that kind of novel. It's more action-oriented. The prose, I rated an 8.5. Totally solid prose. I don't think there were any parts where the prose absolutely blew my mind, but I also never came across any tired phrasing or terms, and Powers did a great job describing the action scenes and the surreal without it becoming insanely confusing, which is an art in itself. And with that said, the prose doesn't get in the way of itself. And certain scenes are already sticking to me. Some of they have left an impression. And so that's a sign of really good writing. And originality, I rated it a 9. It was definitely a creative take on a labyrinth story, and using the vibrations from the cars to generate that field that you can be kind of connected to some other dimension is really, really cool. So definitely a 9 there. World building, I rated an 8.5. Powers made everything seemed like it could, like as usual, like it could be a possibility. And there were just like a few more details that I wanted, but overall I thought the world building was great and believable. And so then the book, Alternate Routes, overall I would rate an 8.3. Well, that's it. Thank you for tuning in. And remember to subscribe and hit the notifications bell if you'd like to continue following our reviews. Next review, I'll be returning to the Expanse series, and I'm going to review book 4, which is Sibylla Burns. So I'll see you then. Bye.